Hello, I am Jonathan Crook, Print Technical Consultant for HP. In this video, I'm going to show policy setup in HP Security Manager. Today I'm using HP Security Manager 3.15 in Windows Server 2022. So with Security Manager, one of the biggest strengths is the ability to set up the policies that you push down to the printer devices on your network, right? So, but creating them, sometimes people get a little hesitant, right? So to create policies, we're going to go under the Policies tab. Inside the policies, we're going to see a list of all the policies here. Now, as you can see, there are multiple policies. Security Manager allows you to create as many policies as you like. Obviously, I would recommend probably not having 50 different policies, but I would recommend you have a few, right? And don't be afraid to give them a nice, decent name so you understand what that policy is referring to, right? Because we don't want to have to go back into the policy, edit it just to look and see what settings are a part of that policy. So it could be a policy that's for HR. You might put HR in the name. If it's a policy for enhanced security, you put that in there knowing what enhanced security means. That's up to you, but you can see here I've got a few names here to choose from. You know, firmware security check versus firmware version check, right? This one checks for the version of the firmware. This one checks on security posture if there's any known security vulnerabilities in the firmware versions, right? So definitely naming them is going to give you an advantage down the road when you come back in here and you're looking at the system. But to create a new policy, we're going to go over to this blue bar here, which you've seen in other videos, and we're going to hit new policy here. Now, again, giving it a name is the most important thing. For this video, I'm just choosing video. And then you can see here we have template. So HP gets a lot of questions around what does HP recommend to make sure my printer is secure? And the reality is that's something that you as an organization have to decide on, right? You know, we can't help you ultimately say, you know, this is how you maintain your security posture. It depends on the environment, right? But what we have done is we have a base policy and we have an essential policy. These are actually based on the NIST guidelines regarding printer security on a network, right? So the base policy, I do believe, has about 50 something settings. The essential policy has about 10 to 15 or something like that. Now, one of the things I do recommend is while the base policy does have all those settings, it's not necessarily a good idea to always create a singular policy that has 30 different settings, right? Because if you think about it, right, when the system is going out to these printers and it is pushing settings and it's remediating and assessing, it's got to do every single one of those settings. So the more settings in a policy, the longer it takes per device in that instance, right? Because you could have multiple policies running at different times on the network, and it's not creating as much bandwidth on the network. Now, Security Manager definitely is not a network resource hog compared to, say, WebJet Admin, but it is a good practice, right? You don't want to have a policy that's too large, right? So for me, I'm a big fan of blank policies just because one of the biggest things I like about this is the search inside creating a new policy is really good compared to other search tools that you may have used within HP or search tools from other organizations, right? So you can see here, there's a lot of different tabs over across here. And then as you go through these tabs, there's different sections here. So this can get very cumbersome or just very confusing depending if it's your first time in here. And that's where I said the search is really good, right? So we're going to look at TLS, right? So TLS is something that comes up more and more with networks. And then you can see we've got authentication wired, authentication wireless for 802.1x, and then we've got web encryption settings or active ciphers, right? So TLS a lot has to do, you know, from what I've experienced is the web encryption, right? So when we click on it, it takes us right to that setting. Network services, web, and here is the setting itself, right? Now, what's important is that you keep track of what you are doing in these policies. Hopefully you already have security policies guideline, right? You know, most companies have guidelines for security settings for laptops and servers and routers. Printers should be no exception, right? You should have that already outlined. in documentation somewhere, right? So what you're doing is essentially you're setting up policies to follow that documentation. But to enable this setting for this policy, right, we're going to check it off, and you can see here all of a sudden everything lights up, right? Everything down here, the drop downs come alive, because when it's not checked off, you can see that everything's grayed out right here. So we're basically saying, I want this setting. So now the first thing is with these settings are the top three. You're going to see these top three on every single setting that I've ever touched inside of Security Manager. So the first one is severity, low, medium, and high risk. Okay, if you looked at the dashboard, the overview, that dashboard, it has that little circular pie. This is where you determine what kind of severity is this setting today, right? Is this a medium risk? Is this a high risk? Is this a low risk? Maybe we're not as worried about TLS today. But the nice thing about Security Manager with setting up policies is you can go back in and edit them. So let's say, for instance, today it's a medium because we're not concerned, but we do want to be aware of devices on the network that can't follow this setting, right? Well, that's great. It's medium. And then 6 months down the road, you guys say, you know what? We need to make sure devices on the network follow this policy now. We don't have any exceptions. So then you can come back in and edit it and then switch it to high. And now the system is going to report it as a high risk instead of a medium risk. So you actually have the ability to go in and change the policies after the fact and adjust them according to how your security policies change internally. Okay. So the next one here is remediation. So while I said earlier, in a policy, you can have multiple settings, you can go in there and say, this setting, I don't want Security Manager to remediate it. I don't want it to fix it, but I do want to know about it, right? And so you disable that. So what that means is that, let's say I had 4 settings in this policy, all of them are set to remediate except for this one. And when I run that policy as a task, I run it as a remediation policy, but this will supersede that policy push. And so what'll happen is it won't actually remediate the setting. It's just going to report on it. Okay. And so with something like TLS, it's not necessarily a bad thing because you might have something internally that makes that maybe it needs to be at 1.0 for some reason, right? Who knows, right? But by disabling it, you're ensuring that you're not breaking communication either until you're absolutely ready for it. But this remediation basically allows you to say, don't remediate this setting, even though there are multiples in the policy, and I can just it'll just report on it. Or you could say, okay, yes, we want to enable it and we want remediation to happen. The third one is probably the most crucial in my experience, right? Is as you guys develop your security policies, you might go from a medium to high risk, but you guys might also say, we can't have anything on the network that can't follow at least TLS 1.2 or 1.3. We can't have any printers on the network, right? So what happens is if we cannot remediate this, you could actually flip this over to what's called a failure. And that's what it means by unsupported, is that essentially, if we find a printer on the network that cannot follow this policy, we are going to send out an immediate alert to you guys saying, hey, there's a failure on the network. That's what this does here. So outside of the normal reporting or alerts, this triggers a failure alert because guess what? We cannot remediate this machine because it does not have the capability. Most HP printers today, they can at least go up to 1.2, but you might have a printer on the network that can't go up to 1.3, right? And so that's what this setting here does, is it forces what's called a failure, and it triggers that immediate alert and allows you to say, hey, this printer on the network can't follow this policy. Or you can say it ignores it, right? And ignore, it's just going to report on it during the regularly scheduled reporting that is going on. So I'm not going to touch anything else here, right? But one of the other things we have with policy creation is this validate button here, right? So we're going to click on validate, and then you can see here, it says policy is valid, no errors are found. Okay, great. That setting looks good. Okay, so now I'm going to go over and let me see here. I'm going to pick on general. And you know what? I'm going to do telnet, and that is a high risk in my opinion, right? And then we want it disabled because we don't want telnet at all. And we're going to hit validate again. And yep, that looks good. This button actually does all of the settings, just as a habit for myself, right? As I pick a setting, I hit validate just to make sure, right? But if, let's say we pick something that is wrong, right? So we come into credentials and I say EWS password, right? Well, if I hit validate without setting anything in here, you can see what's going to happen here. So it's going to trigger a red, right? Exclamation point. It reds the tab, it reds the subsection, and it even reds here, right? And it basically highlights what you're missing, which is what is that password length. So the validate button will also show you obviously any errors, and we do a very good job as far as showing you where those errors are. So if you have multiple settings, or if you're on another tab, you can see it's still showing red here, right? So we come into red, we go into credentials, red, poof, there we are. So that's what that validate button does. It actually helps make sure that everything, every setting you've plugged into this policy is good. Once it's done, we click on save and it is going to go in there. It's going to save it. Now, this window doesn't automatically close, so you're going to want to click this close button. And now you can see here, I've got my video policy ready to go, to be ran as a task on one of the groups. I hope this has been informative for you. Have a great day.